The first thing to understand about Hospital Apprentice First Class Robert Eugene Bush is that he was 18 years old, and he had grown up in a house that smelled like iodine. His mother had raised him alone in a small mill town on the Washington coast, working nights as a nurse and days as a midwife, and the sound Robert Bush associated with love as a boy was the click of a bag being unclasped in the dark and the low, calm voice of a woman telling somebody they were going to be all right. On the second day of May 1945, on a nameless ridge on the island of Okinawa, that boy, 18 years old, 5 months out of field medical service school, 31 days into the worst fighting of the Pacific War, was crawling forward through mortar fire with a corpsman's kit slung across his back and a Colt 45 automatic on his hip. Up ahead of him, on the ridge skyline, a Marine lieutenant was down. The attack had just crested the ridge. Company G, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had pushed up through artillery and machine gun fire and taken the top, and the lieutenant had made it to the crest with them, right up until whatever had hit him, hit him. Now he was lying on the skyline in plain view of the whole island, and his uniform was going dark where the blood was pooling, and his color was the color a corpsman never wants to see. Not white, not gray, but that specific washed-out shade that means the blood is leaving the face because it can't be spared anywhere else. He needed plasma. Now. Bush went to him. He did not run heroically upright the way a movie corpsman would. He went low, the way his instructors at Camp Pendleton had drilled into him. Half crawl, half scramble, one hand steadying the aid bag against his ribs so it wouldn't clatter, the other hand feeling ahead through churned-up dirt. Mortar rounds were coming in high and coming in short and coming in short again, walking a line across the ridge that any minute now was going to walk across him. He reached the lieutenant. The officer was still breathing, his eyes tracked, which was something. Bush's hands were already moving, the same hands his mother had watched him use at 12 years old to pick splinters out of a logger's palm on the kitchen table in Raymond. He tore open a dressing. He found the wound. He pressed. And he saw immediately that pressure wasn't going to be enough. He needed to get plasma into this man, and he needed to do it fast. And to do that, he needed to raise the bottle up above the body, because that's how plasma works. Gravity is the pump. The bottle has to be higher than the wound, higher than the heart, higher than the fear, or the line doesn't feed. Bush hooked up the plasma set. His fingers did not shake. He lifted the bottle. And in that moment, he made himself a target that no one on the far side of the ridge could possibly miss. A clear glass bottle, sunlit, held up over the skyline, held up by the arm of a boy in a corpsman's dungarees. That was when the Japanese counterattack came. Bush would say later, in that flat, plain-spoken way he had for the rest of his life, that he didn't look at it as anything more than he'd been doing the 31 days before. But the 31 days before had not asked what May 2nd was about to ask. The 31 days before had not asked him to hold life in one hand and kill with the other, in the same breath, on a skyline where every enemy weapon on that ridge could see him. 2 days before his 19th birthday, in a suit he had borrowed for the occasion, an 18-year-old boy from Raymond, Washington would stand on the south lawn of the White House and let the President of the United States pin the Medal of Honor around his neck. But first there was the ridge. And on the ridge, the plasma bottle had to stay up. The town Robert Eugene Bush came out of does not appear in most histories of the Second World War. It is not on the way to anywhere. It sits on a slow gray river in the southwest corner of Washington state, in the country between the Willapa Hills and the Pacific. And in 1926, it was a lumber town, cedar mostly, and Douglas fir and hemlock. If you had walked the wooden sidewalks of Raymond in the year Robert Bush was born, you would have smelled two things everywhere you went: green wood and the salt of the tide flats. Those are the smells that made him. He was born on the 4th of October, 1926, not in Raymond, but 100 miles north, in Tacoma, on Puget Sound. His father, Carl Bush, worked in the mills near Tacoma, coming home with sawdust in the cuffs of his pants and pitch on his hands. His mother, Estelle, was a nurse. In a country where women in 1926 were often expected to stop working when they married, Estelle did not stop. She kept her hands in the work she'd been trained for, and she had a second trade that made her invaluable in a small town. She was a midwife. That combination, nurse and midwife, meant that in the small house where Robert learned to walk, there was always a black leather bag by the front door always packed, and it left with his mother at any hour of the day or night when a phone call came in. When Robert was 4, in 1930 or thereabouts, his parents divorced. In those years in that country, a divorce for a woman with a small child was not a soft landing. Stell moved down to Raymond and took her boy with her, and she went on doing what she had done in Tacoma. She nursed, she delivered babies, she stitched cuts, she pressed damp claws to fevered foreheads, she said the same steady sentences over and over to people in bad moments. You're going to be all right. Look at me. Breathe. Her son grew up watching her do it. He did not grow up watching some idealized picture of medicine in a big city hospital with gleaming tile and starched uniforms. He grew up watching a single woman with a leather bag come in the front door at 3 in the morning with somebody else's blood on her cuffs and go straight to the sink to wash. He grew up hearing her voice through the wall as she talked a mother in labor down from a scream. He grew up understanding, without anyone ever explaining it to him, that what a nurse does is stand between another person and the thing that is trying to take that person off the earth, and stand there without flinching until it lets go. He was not a big talker. He was not a hellraiser. He was a Depression-era Pacific Northwest boy. Polite, quiet, useful with his hands. He fished the sloughs. He walked the woods. In the summers, when he was old enough, he went into the mills. By the time he was 15, he had a full-time man's summer job in a Grays Harbor sawmill, feeding rough green lumber into an edger, breathing sawdust, listening for the shift whistle. He learned early what most young men in Raymond learned early. Your body was your inheritance, and there were very fast ways to lose parts of it if you weren't paying attention. He kept all his fingers. That was not a given. Pearl Harbor was bombed when Robert Bush was 15 years old. He listened to the radio like every other boy in America listened to the radio that Sunday. 2 years later, in 1943, at the age of 16, he made a decision that a great many sons of single mothers were making that year. He dropped out of high school. He kept working the mill full-time to help his mother with the household, and he began quietly thinking about the Navy. He did not choose the Navy because he loved ships. He did not choose it because he wanted to be a hero. He chose the Navy because the Navy trained corpsmen, and corpsmen did the work his mother did, the standing between a person and the thing trying to take them off the earth. And it was the only work Robert Bush had ever seriously wanted to do. The 5th of January, 1944, 3 months after his 17th birthday, with his mother's signature on the papers because he was still a minor, Robert Eugene Bush walked into the Navy recruiting station in Seattle and enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve as an apprentice seaman. He did not tell anyone in Raymond he was going to become the youngest sailor of the war to wear the Medal of Honor. He did not know it himself. He was 17 years old and his mother had made him promise to write. The Navy sent Robert Bush inland. That is one of the peculiarities of the American war machine in 1944. The Navy trained many of its recruits not on the ocean, but in the mountains of northern Idaho, on the shore of a long, cold lake called Pendorea. The base was called Farragut, and in 1944 it was one of the largest naval training stations in the world. And to a boy from a Washington mill town, it looked like a small city that had been dropped in a forest overnight. Bush did his recruit training there, then he stayed. Farragut also housed the Naval Hospital Corps School, and Bush had been slated for the Hospital Corps from the beginning. He learned the things a corpsman learns: anatomy, the names of bones, the names of drugs, the way a body reacts to shock. He learned how to open a sterile field with clean hands. He learned how to give an intramuscular injection without hurting a patient more than the sickness already had. He learned for the first time in a formal way the thing his mother had taught him informally for 17 years: how to be calm when the person in front of you cannot be. From Farragut, he went to Seattle, back to his home country briefly, to serve at the Seattle Naval Hospital. This was, in a sense, the closest he ever came to being what he had originally imagined he would be: a hospital corpsman inside a hospital, taking pulses, changing dressings, walking clean corridors under electric light. He was there only long enough to be told he was going somewhere else. Next assignment was Camp Pendleton in California, and specifically the Field Medical Service School attached to the Fleet Marine Force Training Center. This is where the Navy took its hospital corpsmen and turned them into something the Navy alone in the American Armed Forces of that era produced: sailors who would go ashore with the Marine Corps. Bush did not know when he showed up at Pendleton that the Marine Corps had Navy corpsmen. Very few civilians did. He learned in the dust of Southern California that his rating and his fate had just been merged with the ground pounders. He would land where they landed. He would sleep where they slept. He would be shot at with the same rifles that shot at them, and he would carry no rifle of his own because the Geneva Convention that Roddy Edmonds would invoke later that same year in a snowfield thousands of miles away said that a medic was a non-combatant. Non-combatant in the Pacific of 1945 was a fine legal category and a very poor field description. Bush trained at Pendleton for weeks. He learned to hike with a corpsman's pack. He learned to work casualties in the dark. He learned that if you froze even for a second when the call came, someone died. He was promoted along the way, from apprentice seaman to seaman second class, and then to hospital apprentice second class. On the 10th of February 1945, Bush received the assignment that would put him inside history. He was ordered to Headquarters Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, Fleet Marine Force. The 5th Marines were one of the oldest and most decorated infantry regiments in the Corps. Belleau Wood in the last war, Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu in this one. And they were about to sail for an operation that was still, at that hour, classified. On the 1st of March 1945, Bush was advanced to Hospital Apprentice First Class. On the 1st of April 1945, Easter Sunday, also April Fool's Day, the 1st Marine Division waded ashore on Okinawa. The landings on Okinawa were, at the very beginning, the strangest thing anyone in the 1st Marine Division had ever seen. The men had expected another Peleliu. They had expected another Iwo Jima. They had expected a beach whose sand would be black with blood before the second wave. They came in braced for it, jaws locked, throats dry, watching the tree line for the muzzle flashes that would tell them where death lived that morning. And the beach was quiet. The Japanese, in one of the strategic decisions of the war, had chosen not to defend the beach. They had pulled their main body deep inland and dug in behind a series of ridges that would become names Americans would remember for the rest of the century. Sugarloaf, the Awacha Pocket, Wannadraw, Shuri. The whole northern half of the island fell to the Americans in a matter of days. Marines walked past unburned villages. Marines drank from wells that had not been poisoned. It felt briefly and dangerously like they had been given a strange gift. Bush went ashore with 2-5 and began the work. Even in the quiet north, a rifle company generates casualties. There were mines. There were snipers hiding in the roots of old trees. There were the ordinary horrors of a body moving too fast over ground that had already been fought over once in 1944 and once again in the winter of 1945 and would be fought over yet again before the war ended. Bush treated all of them: sprained ankles, heat exhaustion, sniper wounds, a ricochet in a Marine's calf that had traveled from 3 ridges away and still had the strength to break bone. And then, in mid-April, the division turned south. South was where the Japanese were waiting. South was where the war on Okinawa became, in every American memory that survived it, the worst fighting of the Pacific. South was mud and rain, and dead men left in the rain because the front had moved past them and no one could get to them yet. South was ridges that had to be taken twice because the enemy would infiltrate back through caves at night and reoccupy them from the reverse slope. South was the kind of fighting where a corpsman's kit ran out of morphine by noon. Bush worked the line. He was at 18 the youngest man in his section most days. He was also, by early consensus, one of the best of them. He had the hands. He had the calm. He had the thing his mother had put in him without ever saying it out loud. The willingness to walk toward the sound of somebody in pain and to not slow down before he got there. He would say later in his laconic way that the whole month was just work. He said the same thing to the Army medic Desmond Doss when the two of them met after the war, after Doss had earned his own Medal of Honor on a different Okinawa ridge. With the help of God, he told Doss and a few Marines, I got through. By the end of April, Bush had been under fire more times than he could remember. He had lost weight. He had lost sleep. He had lost some of the boyishness in the face. The Milltown roundness had been carved out of it by rations and exhaustion. And what remained was a set of eyes that had learned, in exactly 31 days, to see wounds the way his mother had always seen them, as problems to be solved, right now, with the tools in the bag. On the 1st of May, 2-5 was ordered forward toward another ridge. On the 2nd of May, at the top of that ridge, a Marine officer went down on the skyline, and someone shouted for a corpsman. The skyline of a ridge is the worst place in the world to be wounded. Every infantryman knows this. It is the first thing you learn before anyone teaches you how to shoot. Do not silhouette yourself. Do not put your body between the enemy and the sky. The sky is white and empty, and it makes anything in front of it into a target. The Marine officer of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had made the crest of the ridge, and something, a burst of machine gun fire, or a fragment from an artillery round, had taken him down right there on the skyline. He was lying in the open. He was losing blood fast. And the enemy on the reverse slope of the ridge could see him as clearly as you can see this page. Bush moved to him. He did not consult anyone. He did not weigh it. He had spent 31 days learning that the only way to save the ones who could be saved was to reach them before their bodies made the decision for them. He went up the ridge crouched low, with the aid bag against his ribs, and he came onto the crest and he found the lieutenant, and he went to his knees beside him. Blood was coming from somewhere in the officer's torso. Bush found the wound. He packed it and he pressed and he called for plasma, and someone shoved it into his hand. A heavy little glass bottle, wrapped in a rubberized fabric sleeve, with a length of tubing already coiled around it. Bush hooked it up. He got the needle into the vein. His fingers, from 1,000 hours of practice on cardboard forearms at Farragut, and on real forearms at Seattle Naval Hospital, and on lice-bitten forearms at Camp Pendleton, did not fumble. The line filled. The tubing warmed, and then he lifted the bottle. He held it up above his shoulder, up above the officer's chest, up into the white sky of a ridge on a May morning on an island 7,000 miles from Raymond, Washington. Gravity took over. Plasma began to flow. The lieutenant's color changed, not dramatically, just a fraction, enough for a corpsman's eye to catch it. The way the face pulled back a millimeter from that particular gray, the way the eyes tracked a little more surely. And that is when the Japanese counterattack came over the reverse slope. There is a Japanese phrase that in the after-action reports of Okinawa appears again and again. Banzai was the popular name in the American press, but the tactical reality was more disciplined than the word suggests. What Bush saw was not a screaming rush. What Bush saw was a determined, organized assault by Japanese infantry moving up the reverse slope of the ridge to retake it. Riflemen firing as they advanced, grenadiers behind them, and among them the specific attention of men who had spotted the American medic with the bottle in the air. Bush understood in 1 second what he had done. The bottle had marked him. The bottle had marked both of them. The plasma line was a beacon. He did not lower it. What he did instead was the thing that gets written in citations and that no one who has never done it can quite understand. The bottle still in his left hand, held high, he reached down with his right hand and drew the Colt M1911 pistol from the leather holster on his hip. The M1911 is a heavy sidearm. It kicks. It holds 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. Bush had 8 shots before he needed to reload, and to reload one-handed with a plasma bottle in the other hand is not a thing they teach at Field Medical Service School, because it is not a thing anyone imagines a corpsman doing. He fired. He fired at the Japanese infantry coming up the reverse slope. He fired past the lieutenant's head. He fired with a corpsman's hand, the same hand that had pressed the wound 30 seconds earlier. And he kept the bottle up with the other one, and he emptied the magazine into the enemy and put 6 of them down. That is the number in the record. 6 Japanese soldiers fell to a hospital corpsman's sidearm in a firefight where the corpsman had one arm occupied, keeping another man alive. The slide of the Colt locked back on empty. Bush did not have a chance to reload the pistol. Beside him on the ground was the wounded lieutenant's M1 carbine. He took it. He fired all 15 rounds of the carbine's magazine one-handed, the plasma bottle still up. He reloaded it, somehow on that skyline, in that noise without dropping the bottle, and he fired again. That is when the grenades began to land. The first one landed close and threw dirt over him. The second one landed closer and hit him with fragments in the chest and shoulder, and left an entry wound under his left arm that would, when the doctors on USS Relief got a look at it later, turn out to have compromised the tissue of his lung. The heavy leather shoulder holster of the .45 caught fragments that would otherwise have opened the great vessels in his armpit. The holster, in other words, likely saved his life. He had no scarring at the armpit itself after the war. The leather had been there in the way. The third grenade took his right eye. He was, at the moment the third grenade blew, still holding the plasma bottle up. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the fact. The plasma flow to the lieutenant did not stop when Robert Eugene Bush's right eye left him. He kept the bottle in the air, half blind, bleeding into what was left of his own uniform, on a skyline where any second could still be his last, because if the bottle went down, the lieutenant went with it. An 18-year-old boy, on a ridge on Okinawa, with one eye gone and one lung compromised, and a Colt 45 emptied and an M1 carbine emptied twice, kept a Marine officer alive with a piece of glass held over his own head, and then Company G came back over the top. The Marines who had not gone down in the counterattack pushed forward. They cleared the reverse slope. They killed or drove off the Japanese who had come up to retake the crest. The fire slackened. The sky, which had been full of everything, was suddenly full of only sky. Bush was still on his knees beside the lieutenant. The bottle was still up. A corpsman on a ridge does not get to lie down first. Other Marines came to Bush. They saw the eye. They saw the blood on his uniform. They saw the way he was breathing, which was wrong. Shallower than it should have been, because there was fluid where air belonged. They tried to take the bottle from him. He would not give it up. He finished the plasma. He gave what remained of the fluid to the officer whose life he had bought with the last hour of his own strength. And only when the bottle was empty did he lower his arm. His arm, by then, had been held above his head for so long that when he tried to bring it down, the muscles refused for a second. The way an arm will lock, mid-motion, after asking too much of it. He let other Marines help move the lieutenant. He did not, as some accounts have suggested and some accounts have corrected, allow himself to be evacuated first. He was the corpsman. His job was the patient. He walked beside the litter with what was left of his own body, and he did not sit down until they had made it to the company aid station at the base of the ridge. And then, at the aid station, in front of the men whose job it now was to save him, Robert Eugene Bush finally allowed himself to collapse. He did not know at that moment that the lieutenant would live. He did not know that his own right eye was gone forever. He did not know that the lung wound under his arm would take months to close. He knew only that he had run out of things his mother would have called useful, and that the men around him now had the tools he did not, and it was time to let them work. They moved him back through the aid chain, battalion aid, regimental aid, division aid, and then, because the wounds were serious enough, out to the beach and out to the ships. He came aboard the USS Relief, a Navy hospital ship, and the surgeons there confirmed what the corpsman forward had already seen. The right eye was destroyed. The face would heal in the way faces heal, with scars, with time, with pieces of him that would never quite belong to him the way they had before the ridge. The lung would be repaired. The other eye would be watched closely because fragments had hit it too, and a corpsman's son with one working eye was a possibility no one wanted to consider. He was moved from relief to hospitals farther and farther east, Guam, then Hawaii, then the West Coast. In every hospital ward, he sat quietly and let the professionals do their work. He was famous on the wards for being the youngest patient with a Medal of Honor recommendation in his file, but he did not speak of it, and the men who lay in cots beside him did not press. The time he made it back to the mainland, doctors had confirmed the right eye was permanently blind. To rebuild the hand-eye coordination he would need for civilian life, Bush spent hour after hour on a ping-pong table on the hospital's rec floor, tracking the little white ball with the eye he had left, teaching his brain to compensate. He got very good at ping-pong. He kept the habit for years afterward. There is something almost domestic about that image. The 18-year-old Medal of Honor recipient in a hospital gown, learning to see out of one eye by chasing a plastic ball across a folding table. And it is closer to the truth of who Robert Eugene Bush was than any of the more famous images we have of him in uniform. On the 26th of July, 1945, at Naval Hospital, Oakland, California, HA-1C Bush was medically discharged from the Navy. In September of 1945, 4 months after the ridge, he married a young woman named Wanda Spooner. He was still recovering from his wounds. He was, in the eyes of the law, an 18-year-old veteran with no high school diploma and only one working eye. He was also, though he did not yet know it, about to be summoned to the White House. On the 5th of October, 1945, a Friday, sunlit, autumnal, the city of Washington, D.C., threw a celebration for Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. They called it Nimitz Day. The Pacific War was over. The commander who had led the Navy across the biggest ocean on Earth had come home to be honored, and the country wanted to see him. In the middle of the crowd on the White House South Lawn stood a very young man in a borrowed suit on his honeymoon, 2 days before his 19th birthday, with a fresh scar over the socket where his right eye used to be. He was one of 14 men who would receive the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States that afternoon. He was the youngest of them. Harry S. Truman, wearing his round rimless glasses and his careful Missouri manners, moved from man to man. He came to Robert Bush. He read the citation aloud. He talked about a ridge and a plasma bottle and a Colt 45 and an M1 carbine and 3 grenades and a Marine officer who was still alive because a corpsman from Raymond, Washington had refused to lower his arm. And then he placed the ribbon of the Medal of Honor over the young man's neck. Bush's wife of a few weeks was watching. His mother, Estelle, the nurse from Raymond, the reason he had ever picked up a corpsman's bag in the first place, was watching. It is not recorded in the biographical files exactly what she said to him that night. It does not need to be. Anyone who has ever been raised by a single mother in a small town knows that the sentence she said, in some form, was the sentence she had said to 100 patients in 100 bad hours. You did all right. Bush went home to Washington State. He finished high school on the GI Bill in 1946. He enrolled at the University of Washington and took a business degree in 1950. He was, by then, 23 years old for a college graduate by the standards of that era. Young for what he was about to do next. He bought a small lumber operation in South Bend, Washington, not far from Raymond, and he set about turning it into something. The ordinary way of the men of that generation who came home from the war and did not thereafter talk very much about the war, a way that is now largely gone from American life. He simply went to work. He was in the mill offices at 7 in the morning. He was on the yards at 9. He was on job sites at 11. Over the next 50 years, a lumber yard in a Washington coast town became a multi-million-dollar business under his hand. He did not, in those 50 years, seek attention. He served. He served on veterans boards. He served on hospital committees. From October of 1971 to November of 1973, he served as president of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, the body that speaks for the Americans who wear that ribbon. And in that role, he became one of the quiet, unshowy voices of his generation of recipients. When reporters over the years asked him about the ridge, he gave the same answer he had given Desmond Doss. With the help of God and a few Marines, I got through. When reporters pressed him about the word hero, he shook his head. I don't think I was a hero by any stretch of the imagination. I was out there doing what I was paid to do, trying to protect a man's life. He died on the 8th of November 2005 in Tumwater, Washington, of kidney cancer. He was 79 years old. He is buried at Fern Hill Cemetery in Menlo, Washington, a small country cemetery close to the mill towns that raised him, where the salt of Willapa Bay comes in on the fog in winter. And this is where a story like his ordinarily ends. Except, in the desert of Southern California, at the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, 29 Palms, the largest Marine Corps base in the world, there is a naval hospital. Marines who train at 29 Palms are treated there. Their families are treated there. Corpsmen work its wards. Nurses walk its corridors. When a Marine's wife goes into labor at 29 Palms, she is admitted through the doors of that hospital, and a Navy nurse holds her hand and tells her, in a low, steady voice, that she is going to be all right. The hospital is called Robert E. Bush Naval Hospital. Every Marine who has ever been treated inside those walls has been treated inside a building named for the 18-year-old corpsman who held a plasma bottle over a wounded lieutenant's chest on a ridge on Okinawa on the 2nd of May 1945, while 3 grenades tried to take him off the earth and did not entirely succeed. He would have been embarrassed by that. He was that kind of man. But it is right that the hospital carries his name, because the whole story, the mill town, the single mother, the leather bag by the door, the boy watching a nurse do her work, the ridge, the bottle, the 45, the eye, the 50 years of quiet civilian life, is one long story about what a nurse's son does when the world hands him a moment that only a nurse's son can meet. Robert Eugene Bush was 18 years old. On a ridge in Okinawa, in May of 1945, he did what his mother had done every night of his childhood in a small town on a slow gray river in the far corner of Washington State. He stood between a man and the thing that was trying to take that man off the earth, and he did not flinch.